it's not that I think intuition is bad. It's just that I think we really need to stop projecting our shit. Hey lovelies, today I want to talk about intuition and particularly its relationship to a more structured form of reading that leans into the tarot as what I and others have referred to as a mandala of 78 cards, as a kind of sacred map of the human psyche and its evolution or transformation or development. My fundamental approach to the tarot, mindful tarot, is built in a notion that the tarot isn't just a disconnected collection of 78 cards of 78 different meanings, and then if you do reversals, another 78 different meanings. Instead, that the tarot is an interconnected system that portrays the changing and shifting facets of human consciousness and experience. And that understanding its interconnected parts, understanding the ways in which each card that we draw relates to the whole of the tarot system, that is what will help us use the tarot as a tool for ourselves and for others in our pathways forward, in our pathways toward greater happiness, ease, balance, harmony. If we treat the tarot as a systematic whole, as a mandala, a sacred map, of the human psyche and its experience, if we treat the tarot as a whole, the tarot will help make us and our querents whole. So that's my fundamental approach, which is why I have video after video talking about the history of the deck, talking about the story of different suits, talking about things like number and arrangement, talking about how to learn to speak tarot, recognizing the tarot as a language that we can gain fluency and proficiency in. I'm always encouraging us to dive into the structure of the tarot and into the systematic relationship, the interconnected relationship of all of its parts. So, where does intuition fit in? That's what I want to talk about today. And I want to present some of my favorite decks for working with the tarot intuitively. And for those of you who want to take a deeper dive into this issue, I invite you to join the Mindful Tarot community. You can do that by dropping me an email. Look in the description box below for more information, because in July, I'm making this video on the 28th of June 2021. In July of this year, we'll be doing on my Mindful Tarot Facebook page a challenge around intuition and tarot, and particularly working with intuitive decks. So today I want to show off some of my favorite intuitive decks and explore this issue of intuition a bit more. First of all, intuition, what is it? Yeah, good question. We might think of intuition as our knowing things without knowing how we know. Right? So intuition is that deep knowing that kind of exceeds our capacity to articulate knowing. There's a quote from a classicist who's written about the history of divination in the ancient world. I'll pop that quote in here. We actually know more than we think we know, right? Than we are able discursively to represent. Now, probably one of my top two favorite intuitive decks is Melissa Weatherspoon's Lonely Dreamer Tarot. My brain froze right there. Based on the surrealist, the work of surrealist painter Odilon Redon. And in that deck, the second edition, she includes a card. Odilon Redon apparently actually studied, was very interested in Buddhism. I have a comparison video of the first and second editions of this deck of Melissa's. The second edition included one of his Buddha paintings, and she titled it Intuition. This is what Melissa says about intuition, and particularly this card. She says, This is the inner voice that we all have inside of us, whispering to us and encouraging us to follow our true path. If this card comes up for you in a reading, ask yourself if you are trusting your intuition more. The more you trust, the stronger it becomes. I love that she uses the Buddha to talk about this intuition, another card that one might associate with this. And in this deck, that card is actually ascribed to one of Redon's Buddha paintings. It is the hermit, right? The inner knowing, the inner light of the hermit. Let me see if I can find that card real quick. So here in the Hermit, we have another Buddha image. And why I like Melissa's choice of using Redon's Buddhism paintings for the cards Intuition and for the Hermit is because this inner knowing, it doesn't just like, how do I want to put this? This inner knowing actually requires practice to hone and to lean into. It's inner and it exceeds our sort of conscious grasp, but it's not just randomly popping up from the inside. The danger with what we often call intuition is that it's impossible at first blush to distinguish it from just projection, just merely us like kind of grabbing hold of our kind of initial impulse. You know, that way leads us into the realms of implicit bias and prejudice and racism and privilege and all sorts of gnarly things, right? You know, when you just go with what you think you know what you've always known, right? How do you actually get past your shadow side, right? How do you actually get past that kind of buried karmic shit that we tend to just spray onto the world? The problem with intuition is that, you know, it's all so too easy to just project our own crap on the world and say, that is you, when in fact, what we're seeing is just some of the dark, karmic, often just garbagey stuff inside. So this true intuition, the knowing that exceeds our conscious knowing, that comes from a deeper source, that comes from mind, divinity, source, whatever you want to call it, God. That's real. You know, that's maybe the very origin of the archetypes that populate the tarot. But we need to get to that deeper, truer sense of what is. And that's why we need to actually, even though intuition is what's inside us without our conscious manipulation or grasping, that's why we actually need to train our intuition. And fortunately, guess what? The tarot is an amazing tool for training the intuition. So let's talk about how that works. You know, one of the things that I really love to do with the tarot is to work with historical versions of the deck, like the Tarot de Marseille, in order to train my eyes in terms of structure. To be able to see, this by the way is the Vertiable Tarot de Marseille by Kris Hadar. It's not in, I think the second edition was recently republished. It's just a very pretty version of the Tarot de Marseille. Any Tarot de Marseille, the CBD Tarot, which is still in print, really any edition will work for this purpose. But just to get us thinking about things like number and arrangement and element, you know, to ask ourselves, what is it about the Three of Swords that helps me understand this present moment? I drew this card yesterday. I was feeling both the sort of heaviness of the way in which the world is a messed up freaking place right now. I'm sweating like a pig here. It's only 100 degrees in Eugene right now. It was 108. Where I lived, I think it was 108. It went up as high as 114 yesterday. That's crazy hot. That is circles of hell hot, right? This is a temperate climate, Eugene. This is like living in the British Isles, usually living in Eugene. So I was just feeling this total heartache, right? The kind of way in which this piercing of the Three of Swords, the way in which balance, symmetries, the kind of relative initial stability and harmony of the two scimitars pairing off each other is pierced, right? I was feeling that kind of like cut into by the reality of a world that is being blown apart by climate change, and then all the ways our world is being blown apart right now. But the thing about the Three of Swords is it also looks like an eye, right? Like an eye. I mean, particularly maybe I'm thinking like a cat's eye here, where this third sword is like the pupil. And it reminded me of the ways in which our ability to see, to understand, to take in, really comes from the ways in which the light can enter us. And that means being a little bit broken, right? It's like that Leonard Cohen song Anthem and that famous line, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in, right? That's the Three of Swords. That's the way it cuts us open and lets in the light. So yesterday's heartache, the Three of Swords, reminded me of that truth. Now, I am using this incredibly structured deck, this deck that's all about shape and form and is very regular in its presentation of these symbolic archetypes in the trumps, right? Where every element has a meaning that we can talk about allegorically. We can talk about what it is that Temperance is doing with her water and her wine, or her fire and her water. We can talk about what it means for the King of Wands to hold this staff, which looks like a pen, incidentally, that has that kind of sense of inspiration. We can talk about how the coins, the suit of commerce and money, is also the suit of the material world, of seeds, of growth, of potential. How the suit of swords is also the suit of mind, our ability to pierce and grasp and understand. It's very structured, right? Decks like this, these kind of structured decks, support a really kind of, what do I want to say? A really kind of structured reading, right? And the Waite-Smith deck, Pamela Coleman Smith, her deck takes that structure and then turns it into an illustrated language using the suit elements, our swords and our cups, using the allegorical imagery, where every picture carries with it these symbols that we can read and we can interpret, and we can analyze the card and break it down and say, oh, well, okay, these pentacles, right, they're in the shape of the Kabbalistic tree of life, and we can talk about that. We can talk about how we have different generations here. We can talk about the grape leaves on the old man's cloak. We can talk about, what is this retreating figure in the Six of Cups. We can talk about this image of childhood, of what it means for the cups to hold flowers. We can talk about the way in which the elements are portrayed in each of the cards, in the minor arcana, what it means to think of the Queen of Cups as water, the way her cloak looks like water. What water is in this context. We can look at how water is portrayed throughout the deck as a whole. We can talk about the ways in which water in the Temperance card or water in the Star card reflects the way water appears in the suit of water, the cups. We can talk about fire and what it means for the knights to be figures of fire. We can talk about how light works within the deck. As I'm talking through this, what I'm suggesting is all the ways in which these structured decks, the historical decks like the Tarot de Marseille, or the more modern decks based on Waite-Smith's imagery, or the Golden Dawn work that we see in something like the Toth deck, the Crowley-Harris deck. These are all decks that use imagery, arrangement, number, to portray a systematic whole, so that we can start to read all the cards in relationship to one another, and we can get very systematic about it. We can break down all of the imagery in the cards. So the Waite-Smith deck and all the clones that borrow from it, or Terre de Marseille decks and all of the related non-illustrated pip decks like the Terre de Marseille, these decks help us train ourselves to read not what's just being projected from our heart, but to read what's out on the card itself, and to make connections to the circumstances of our lives. These decks teach us to read with structure, with precision. These decks hone our capacity to interpret the tarot. These decks are the decks that we need to practice with in order, I think, to have intuitive readings that aren't just projecting our shit. Now, I'm hoping this makes sense, because now what I want to do is share with you my favorite intuitive decks. And I want to encourage you, as you look at these intuitive decks, to think about the ways in which reading these decks, which require us to just take leaps of imagination, also entail our ability to understand the mandala of tarot, the more systematic forms of reading that we learn through the Waite-Smith or the Terre de Marseille lineages. Okay, so without further ado, my favorite intuitive decks. So there are different kinds of intuitive decks. The Lonely Dreamer Tarot, which, as I say, is like one of my all-time favorite intuitive decks, and maybe just one of my all-time favorite decks, period. This is a deck that's of that kind of intuitive deck that uses an artist's imagery, choosing carefully among the existing canvases or other forms of artwork to match the spirit of typically of the Waite-Smith tarot deck system. So in these kinds of decks, you know, Melissa Weatherspoon, for instance, will think, okay, what is the death card all about? And everything that she understands about the death card is going to have been informed by her work and her understanding of the Waite-Smith lineage, right? So she's going to try to capture the spirit of death as it appears in the Waite-Smith card in the image she chooses from Odilon Redon's body of work, right? Now, what she captures is not going to be a one-to-one correspondence, although what Melissa did with this deck, and what a lot of people do who are using found art, right? The fine art decks like this one, folks will often collage in suit elements to help us know what we're dealing with. But, oh, and this is her shadow card, so that's not one of the, yeah. I love this Page of Pentacles. That shadow card is not one of the actual 78 cards. It's one of her bonus cards. But, you know, something like the Three of Pentacles or the Page of Pentacles, she'll overlay a suit element, or and she does this beautifully. I think Melissa does this more beautifully than anyone I know working with another artist's canon of work. She'll overlay Seven of Wands on her Seven of Wands. But, you know, when she does that, it's done pretty subtly, and each of these cards also captures the spirit of Odilon Redon. So, you know, if this is the Seven of Cups, it's not because it's reproducing literally the imagery of the Waite-Smith deck. It's not a clone deck that uses parts of Odilon Redon's work to give us the Seven of Cups in another kind of set of images. She's capturing the spirit, not the letter, the spirit of the Waite-Smith deck. And so that means that there's now been this intuitive leap on her part to say, this is the Seven of Swords. Look, here it is. So by working with this deck, wow, we really start to hone our own intuition, grasping not just the letter of the Waite-Smith lineage, but its spirit, right? And that's when, I love that Ten of Wands, that's when, I love that world. I love this deck. that's when things really start to leap forward. So yeah, this, I mean, one of my all-time favorite decks. I love this deck so much. I love the cardstock. It's that kind of pliable linen finish, and I love Redon's artwork, and I love how Melissa's used it. It's just a brilliant, brilliant deck. Now, fine art decks often also become really fine intuitive decks, not when they manipulate the image the way Melissa did by subtly adding in suit elements, but by just going whole hog into, here's the spirit of this card. So this is, it's not in print anymore. I think there may have been copyright issues, but this is, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the name of the creator. But this is the Peintures du Monde deck. I got this on Etsy, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. And it's using imagery from the Renaissance through the 19th century for each of the cards. It's a very familiar kind of deck, right? Where you take paintings that are out there in the public commons, and you appropriate parts of the paintings or part of the photographs, part of the images that are out there to capture the spirit of the deck. You know, Melissa's Lonely Dreamer is using one artist. This uses many, many artists. Another version of this might be Cat Black's Touchstone Tarot, which uses portraits from the 16th, I think the 16th century, maybe also 17th century. And so each of the 78 cards is a portrait deck. I love that deck as well. Not as much as I like this deck. I think one of the reasons I love this deck so much is because of this completely amazing Fool. This is a painting by Piero de Cosimo of Simonetta Vespucci, who's like one of the most beautiful, celebrated ladies of her time. Yeah. You know, so each of these cards is Threads of Fate. That's the artist's version of the wheel. She also renamed some of these cards. The Emperor, you know, the Knight of Coins. There's some familiar images here when she uses Waterhouse. So this is the Magician. You get the sense it's a mixture of fine art going from, you know, the 1500s all the way through the 19th century. Very nicely done. Really, I love this deck. And then she also has the 4 elements. I haven't worked with it in a really long time, so I just pulled it out. I love that star card. I think she did add the embellishments here, but mostly she just takes details from paintings, right? You know, it's like the Tarot of Delphi, which is a very collectible out-of-print deck, or the Majestic Earth deck. These are also art decks. Timeless Tarot. There's a number of these, but I think this is my favorite. I like the bridge, card size too. You know, another really wonderful version of this would be Baba Studio's Victorian Romantic Tarot, another art deck, beautifully produced. This just was reissued, so you can get, I think they're still in print. You can get the, whatever it is now, the 3rd edition, 4th edition. You know, the gold stamping is really beautiful. The images are really beautiful. And unlike the Peintures du Monde, which spans like 4 centuries of art, this is all art from the 19th century and all from this same sort of romantic moment in Victorian painting. So it has a really consistent feel. I love using this tarot deck, this particular one, for people who are not into tarot, and I don't tell them I'm doing a tarot reading. I just bring forward the cards. I love that Ace of Swords. Yeah, brilliant. So the Victorian Romantic Tarot, another brilliant version of this kind of fine art deck. And then there are decks like Cilla Conway's deck, the Shimmering Veil, you know, which is a deck that takes the artist's own artwork, some of which was not produced as for the purposes of the deck, but have been appropriated for the deck itself. You know, because of the elusive and slightly surreal, very dreamy nature of Cilla's artwork, which is just extraordinary. These cards are so evocative. Her little guidebook is also quite wonderful. You know, she talks about, she connects her work with this deck. She begins with a short essay talking about why does tarot work, and it takes her into quantum physics and into notions of the universe as being essentially, and this is from a scientific perspective as much as from a spiritual perspective, essentially about consciousness, about the entanglement of neurons and matter at the quantum level. And one of the models for that within quantum mechanics is the idea of the universe as being a kind of crystal lattice. That was the origin of her idea for the shimmering veil. So, you know, she has a very powerful sense of what underlies this deck and the way in which all of the pieces interconnect, and in fact, the ways in which mind and matter interconnect. Like, that's her underlying philosophy. And then the cards just invite you in. I mean, look at it, you know? So one of the things I love about this deck is the very, very subtle way in which titles are offered. So you can just really fall into these cards, almost like Deborah Koff-Chapin, her soul cards, right? Those that her whole touch therapy model. These cards have that kind of evocative appeal and sort of this invitation in, almost as if they're oracle cards, but there is a systematic unity. This is the Four of Wands. It's not the Five of Cups. There is a sense that there's an underlying order to this deck, but it's so loose. Again, it's spirit, not letter, right? It's not saying the Four of Wands. That's about, you know, four wands, like a canopy, like a chuppah, detailing celebration and homecoming. Instead, we get this. Oh, yeah. And here's one of the image where it all started for her. This is this image that she called the Weaver, and this is a detail from that painting. The Weaver is holding that crystal lattice, that entangled sense of the entire universe, and this became her high priestess. Yeah, the Shimmering Veil, incredible deck for working with intuition. This is a very recent acquisition, like just a few days ago. The K Tarot, which is also still available on Etsy, and the artist here very, very deliberately created these evocative, intuitive drawings. They're sort of childlike, so there's a certain element. And this is also, I think, really significant, that kind of harnessing and honing and practicing with our intuition can often be enhanced and sort of taken forward with a spirit of play and playfulness. So there's a kind of childlike quality to a lot of these images. I love this deck. I haven't worked with it at all. It's still in order because I just received it through a trade, and then you know, made sure all the cards were here, but I haven't worked with it. I mean, look at this Hierophant. She created the cards as tarot cards, or she created the images as tarot card images, but in a very loose way. In a very loose way. And accordingly, and this is often true with intuitive decks, and one of their drawbacks, there's not a sharp difference between the cards in the major arcana. So, you know, here's the Hermit, but that image doesn't look really different from a card like the Three of Cups, right? The imagery is very similar, unlike what working with a structured deck like the Tarot de Marseille, you know, a pip card is really, really different from a face card, a court card, and that in turn is also really, really different from that kind of obviously allegorical image of a trump card. With these intuitive decks that are trying to capture the spirit of the cards and kind of free the way we know without knowing, that kind of difference isn't articulated so clearly. So if all we do is work with intuitive decks, we kind of never learn the structure of tarot. And that means we never really learn the mandala of tarot, the way it can be a sacred map leading to our wholeness. So don't just buy decks like this. You know, sometimes we say, it's not a beginner's deck. Well, the reason it's not a beginner's deck is because it doesn't give us firm footing in the structure of the tarot. Okay, the K Tarot. The K Tarot leads me to a couple of other really surreal decks. So Liz Houston's Dreamkeeper's Tarot, which is now available in the mass market edition. Super cool deck. And this does actually have, you know, she constructed her images to be a tarot deck, but they are just gorgeous, elusive, inviting us to free our, like all surrealism, like, you know, the work of Odilon Redon, this invitation to free our unconscious processes, but then it is also tied to the structure of tarot. You know, the Two of Swords has two swords, right? The Page of Cups doesn't give us a guy holding a cup with a fish in it, but it gives us a cup that essentially has a fish in it, which is the central figure. So Liz Houston's Dreamkeeper's Tarot, or Catrin Welz-Stein's Mystical Moments Tarot, another surrealist deck. These images are gorgeous. I'm so sad about the cardstock, and I'm not a fan of gilt edging. I love matte edging, but not gilt edging. Unlike the Dreamkeeper's Tarot, however, this deck has that kind of intuitive tarot thing where there isn't really an obvious difference in type of image from a trump card like the Sun and a pip card, you know, like the Seven of Cups. You know, these images are all really similar types of images. They all are capturing the spirit, not the letter, of a structured tarot deck, but they're not helping us understand the system of images. And I should mention, as I keep talking about the intuitive tarot and talk about these as intuitive tarot decks, that of course, one of the decks that Cilla Conway is most famous for is her deck, the Intuitive Tarot, the second edition of which is still in print. I like that deck quite a lot. I just don't. It doesn't leap to the top like her Shimmering Veil Tarot does. I also want to name one other artist deck, which is really different in its appeal, but incredibly gorgeous. And that's Nora Huzska's Gypsy Palace Tarot, which you can still, I believe you can still get. This deck is just, oh my God, it's just so delicious in its color palette and its type of imagery. Kellyanne Maddox has a really beautiful, now many years old, I think maybe 5 years old, video about this deck where she looks at the aces and talks about the choices that are being made here. And she makes a really strong case for the ways in which this deck, which is super unconventional, nonetheless does really invite a deep connection to the tarot archetypes. But it pushes us to know what we know without knowing. It pushes us intuitively, especially if we are familiar, right, with the tarot. Look at this Ten of Wands. So how is this a Ten of Wands? That's what the intuitive tarot decks that I'm sharing invite us to ask. Invite us to both draw on our knowledge of structured tarot, and also stretch, demonstrating what we know without knowing. I'm looking around. I have so many decks here. I think I'm just going to offer one more example of a really different type of intuitive deck, and that is Michael Bridge-Dickson's Orbifold Tarot, which is a deck that's very structured because all of the images are created by the appropriate number of spheres. So the 6 of the fire suit of wands has 6 red spheres put together, and it very carefully delineates the relationship between its color palette and the suits and the elements. All of these choices reflect a really systematic delineation of how the deck is constructed. But despite that systematic nature, this deck forces us to think intuitively, right? How is this 6 blue spheres, how are these 6 blue spheres, how do these depict the 6ness of the water suit, right? This is a deck that really pushes our intuition in ways that take us back, I think, to the structure of the historical tarot. And that's the thing about working with our intuition. Our structure helps inform the intuitive process, and then if we pursue developing our intuitions sort of deeply and in a thoroughgoing way, we come full around to structure. From the letter to the spirit, back to the letter. Okay, I think I'm just going to put this out there and see how it flies. If this tickles your funny bone, if this tickles your fancy, join the Mindful Tarot community, and we can talk about all this on Facebook or in our monthly community Zoom sessions. I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, thank you so much for your practice. Take good care.